Welcome to the Coaching Revealed podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Austin Matzelle. In this episode of Coaching Revealed, I'm joined with my co-host, Emily Terrani, as we interview Jeffrey Yip, researcher and associate professor of management studies at Simon Fraser University. The episode focuses on Simon's research into the subject of listening in leadership and coaching. So how do we know if we are properly listening? Many people tend to think they are good listeners. Jeffrey mentions a phenomenon where the majority of people assume they are above average at listening. However, listening isn't always a simple task. Through his academic and professional career, Jeffrey has explored psychology, leadership, and management as he has researched what contributes to effective or ineffective listening. Drawing from his extensive career on the transformative power of listening on working relationships and leadership, Jeffrey introduces his Listen and Build framework as a practical way for individuals to continually hone their listening skills. In addition to the framework, Jeffrey introduces the simple concept of brainstorming, which helps leaders and coaches to move towards creating collaborative solutions, even when encountering difficult situations. So get ready for this episode of Coaching Revealed, where we explore what makes listening hard, what can get in our way, and ways to improve the skill. And now, our conversation with Jeffrey Yip. All right, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Coaching Revealed. And we are so excited to have Jeffrey Yip in the studio with us today. Jeffrey, so great to have you.
Thanks, Austin. Glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm joined today with my co-host, Emily Terrani. So the two of us will be asking you some questions about you and your research and work in the space of listening. Just to get us started, could you tell us a little bit about your career in coaching and your work on listening?
Yeah, so how I came to the field of coaching and leadership development is I first started with leadership development in educational settings with an organization I co-founded called the Halogen Foundation, which is still running today, focused primarily on youth leadership development and entrepreneurship. From working with the Halogen Foundation, I went on to work with the Center for Creative Leadership, which is a global leadership development organization. So working primarily on research to understand how leaders develop. And out of that research, it was a global research project looking at leadership development, more specifically in the States. In Asia, we traveled to China as well as India. And we found that developmental relationships play a primary role in leadership development. So while we think leaders develop often through programs, what we found was actually developmental relationships have a significant role. So that's coaching, mentoring, as well as peer relationships in the workplace. So that got me interested to study more. So I went on to do a PhD at Boston University, working with Kathy Cram, who is a professor and pioneer in the field of mentoring, as well as Douglas Tim Hall, who's a pioneer in the field of leadership and career development. And really, my research and work since then has been focused primarily on work relationships, the role of work relationships in facilitating growth for leaders, as well as what leaders can do to build stronger relationships in the workplace.
That's really fascinating. I'm curious what got you interested specifically from the listening lens and angle of coaching. How did this emerge as something that you've spent so much time on, given everything you just explained about how you got into the world of coaching?
Yeah, so it started with looking at leadership, both from a practice perspective, working with and coaching leaders, as well as leadership research. One of the what we call derailment factors, which is what often causes leaders to fail or plateau in a role. The primary derailment factors is interpersonal relationships. So it started there where the thing that's almost hardest for leaders, it's less about technology or structure, but it's really relationships. And then as I dive deep into relationships, I realized one of the things that often is neglected and that leaders tend to overestimate in their ability is their capacity to listen. And it resonated with me both in terms of what I'm seeing in the classroom working with leaders, as well as from research that there is not enough understanding of how leaders can develop listening as a capacity and looking at listening in a range of situations that leaders might be in, listening to organizational change, listening in the context of conflict, listening as a coach. So that really got me focused on specifically on listening in leadership and in coaching.
What issues do you see that leaders typically have when it comes to listening?
Yeah, so the first issue is, and it's a human issue, is we tend to overestimate our listening ability. Often when I teach, I ask, how many of you think you're a good listener? And I'd say almost like 90% of hands go up. But statistically, that's not possible that, 90% are better than average listener. Like if we think of a general curve, like more than 50% is feasible that people are better than average. But so most people think they are, above average listener. That's the first problem. And the challenge is we often take listening for granted that, we listen, I'd say we hear all the time. We're always getting auditory signals. We hear all the time, but listening is different. And so that's the starting point when I think of effective listening is listening is more than just hearing. Listening involves comprehending, really understanding what the other person says. But it's more than that. I often tell leaders that you don't determine whether you're a good listener. The other person determines whether you're a good listener. So it's not just comprehending, but it's communicating back what one hears. And those two pieces of really comprehending and also communicating back what one hears is quite a challenge in the listening process.
Yeah, and I know this idea also ties into a concept we have talked about previously, being naive realism. And so I'm wondering, for our audience today, the coaches out there today, what is that concept of naive realism, and how might that be a perspective one can consider as they're going into a environment where they should be listening to other people?
Yeah, so naive realism is one of the kind of psychological truths that have been studied in the field of psychology, but more broadly now in organizational research. So naive realism is the human tendency to see the world as we are and to assume that truth is basically how we see the world. And often when we encounter a perspective that is different and counter to how we see the world, we tend to discount that as either not truths or lesser truths. And so that in naive realism inhibits two things, prevents us from really learning because we try to fit the world into our perspectives and our truths. And then secondly, it prevents us from listening. It's easy to listen when we're hearing what is consistent with how we see the world. But what is hardest of listening is we tend to discount and not hear perspectives that are different from our own. And that's so critical in kind of both interpersonal understanding as well as personal growth. So naive realism is one of the key barriers to listening.
I think understanding naive realism, and that we actually may be at a deficit in truly understanding other people because we're seeing things through our own lens, is really, really important to address. So thank you for explaining that. Something that I want to move us into then now is taking this research background that you have and the understanding that you have when you are working with leaders on their listening. What does that process look like? What is the protocol that you are developing in this space?
So it starts with naive realism. That's one of the challenge, that we see the world as we are. And one of the keys to growth is really expanding our perspectives on the world. One of the keys to effective coaching is to see the world as through the lens of the person that you're coaching with and how they're experiencing the problem. I guess a barrier to effective coaching is if we interpret what we're hearing from our naive realism lens of the world. So the first point is to realize there are multiple truths, there are multiple ways to see any situation. It's sort of, I like to use the example of the blind people and the elephant. If your listeners are familiar with that, that's a parable of there's an elephant and we have different people touching different parts of the elephant, but they're blind or blindfolded, and they feel different things. And they think, like, the person who's touching the tail of the elephant thinks that thing in front of them is a rope, and others, feel different parts, but it's all the same thing. And so we need to realize that in any situation at work or that a coachee might be facing, is they're seeing it from their perspective. And the starting point to effective coaching is to really understand the world as how the person you're coaching is seeing that. And so that's where listening comes in. So the first step to listening is to kind of release one's assumption about how one understands the problem, to try to really see the situation and hear the situation from the other person's perspective. But that's just a sort of the first step. There are many other steps, and I'm happy to maybe go deeper and explore the different dimensions of that listening process.
It's interesting because there's two layers of it. The coach themselves have to overcome their own naive realism in order to then help a leader overcome it. And it seems like you haven't directly said it, but being a good leader, they possess the trait that they're overcoming that tendency or that bias. Is there like a term that's the opposite of naive realism when you are, listening while being open-minded?
Yeah, there is a term. It's one of the terms used to describe, I would think, the opposite of naive realism is self-expansion, which is seeing the world as incorporating another person's perspective or view on the world into oneself. I love the term self-expansion because that's how we grow. When we start to release our one way of seeing the world, to say there are many ways to see the world. And so that's wonderful in the coaching interaction because coaches can actually grow through the coaching experience. I know coaches are there to help others grow, but coaches themselves can grow as they start to think about, there's a fundamental human tendency towards naive realism. And if I approach every coaching interaction as a way to see a situation differently and to start with where my client is seeing the situation. That's really important, whether it's coaching or leadership. Often one of the aspects I teach with leadership is to tell the story of change from the other person's perspective. Often we have two different stories. And in a coaching encounter, if you're listening to a person share their challenge, now in our heads, we might be formulating our own story of that situation. And that story is often clouded by our own experiences. So one way to be effective or to let go of naive realism is to live that situation through the other person's story. How is the other person seeing it? What is the reality and the truth for that other person? And to start from there.
Yeah, you're speaking of one of the main skills a coach has to possess is really being there with the client and meeting them where they are, not bringing in your own story, your own narrative, your own experience. And it's easier said than done.
What you said, Emily, meeting them where they are is a really hard practice, not just for coaching, but it's for leaders and just being, people in general. Like if we're able to meet other people where they are, we can be so much more collaborative and productive in many, many things.
Going back to one of the points that Emily made in terms of meeting people where they are, what I would love to learn a little bit more about now is taking all your expertise in leadership and listening and working with these individuals on understanding their perspective, the naive realism. When you start working with the leaders and clients that you work with, what process is happening then? I know we've talked a little bit about the idea of you having listening rounds for the clients. Can we learn a little bit more about how that impacts them and what they're going through?
Yeah, thanks, Austin. The meeting them where they are is such a powerful principle for change. So when we think about change, it's about starting from where we are, moving to where we want to go. And so that's something that it's a challenge for leaders. It's a challenge for coaches. It's a challenge even at an individual level. It's trying to understand where I'm currently at and how do I get to where I want to go. But the starting point of we see change as the present and the future. The starting point is to create that bridge from the present going into where one wants to go. So meeting people where we are, I teach this process called the listen and build approach to change. Maybe I'll start with change leadership, and then we can have a conversation to connect it around coaching. I use this process on helping leaders lead change effectively by starting with understanding the lived reality of what people are facing in the organization. So let me start with one of the challenges with change leadership, and maybe one of the challenges even right now that I'm seeing a lot. One of the top of mind kind of change initiatives in organizations today is around AI adoption, around new technologies. And what I'm hearing is, when talking to leaders, is that the fascination with this new technology and what it can accomplish in the organization. And often when they tell the story of change, they tell the story of the promise of the technology and what it can do. But as you might hear talking to others in an organization, often the story in the organization is more about anxiety, about uncertainty, about insecurity about people's jobs. And so much as where people may agree with the story of technology, but what they're really feeling is, well, if I'm going to train this generative AI, like I might be training it to take over my job. And so this fear, uncertainty, and anxiety is often not acknowledged in the story of change. And so just to use that example in kind of meeting people where they are or listening and build to lead change, it starts with understanding the other story, the story of change from other people's perspective. And to be an effective change leader is to tell the story of change from their perspective, and then creating that bridge to where we want to go with, oh, here's my story of change. How can I start with that perspective and bring in my story of change? So that's the same. I think I'm keen to hear your perspective with coaching. It's starting to validate the other person's story and how they're seeing. Validation and meeting people where they are opens the window for change. Oftentimes, what's missing when we try to lead change is when the window's not fully open, we try to push the change forward, push a solution, push a recommendation, push a suggestion, but the window is closed because validation hasn't occurred. So it's this powerful process of actually validating that often is a misstep in leading change and in coaching.
Since you are working with cohorts of executive MBA candidates, looking at all these different components that are important for developing a good sense of leadership and a good sense of listening, what are some of the maybe natural human tendencies we have, or what are some of the challenges individuals are encountering as they're learning to be listening well and they're attempting to move into these bigger leadership positions?
Yeah, so I think the challenge in leadership is one of the same fundamental challenges with coaching. One is the ability to release our assumptions, our naive realism about how we see things, to live in the other person's reality. The second is our human tendency to want to solve problems. I see that particularly with more experienced leaders, that because we have experience and more knowledge, we tend to more quickly come up with solutions to problems. It's a human tendency. We want to add value to situations. And so when we see a problem and we think we have the solution, we're quick to rush to propose the solution. And that is not helpful when validation hasn't occurred. And so one of the challenges really is and it's a challenge that doesn't go away. In fact, it gets harder with more experience, is the quick tendency to problem solve and not to really validate and to understand what the problem is. How I help leaders with this, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts related to coaching, is we actually work through this differentiation between brainstorming and what I call painstorming. People in the workplace are so used to brainstorming, and brainstorming is often a process that's very solution focused. Like, let's generate all these ideas to solve this problem. And so we've been trained and socialized to brainstorm. Whenever we hear a problem, we start to ideate and create solutions for the problem. And so that's what people typically associate with brainstorming. What I teach is I teach a process where we need to start with painstorming first before we go into brainstorming. And painstorming is really understanding what the pain points are and what the challenges are with the workforce that we're working with, the team that we're working with. So even though we have a solution for the problem, now, even though that's the right solution, people are not going to be on board with that solution until their challenges and their pain have been acknowledged and they know that my leader understands this is what we're going through. I see that with technology change. I also see that with one-to-one conversations, and keen to hear your thoughts on if this might apply to coaching too, in terms of the brainstorming versus painstorming process.
Ready to advance your coaching practice? Join the Institute of Coaching and tap into the world's leading resource for coaching science and professional development. With over 4,000 members across 130 countries, the IOC offers invaluable networking opportunities with an elite global coaching community and innovative learning to broaden your knowledge and keep you at the forefront of coaching best practices. Engage in cutting edge learning events with world renowned coaching scholars, from webinars and seminars to discussion groups, research projects, and more. Try any membership free for 30 days. Use promo code IOC Podcast and visit instituteofcoaching.org/join to get started.
Yeah, totally. I hear you speaking of we're working with leaders that they themselves or the people that they're leading are operating from something that is emotionally activating them or dysregulating them. And then the leadership approach typically is let's jump into the solution and solving it, which is generally more something logical. So the coaching can help, address and, like you're saying, validate the fact that there are big emotions that are like the elephant in the room. And so that is where, coaching can help a leader be aware of that, process their own emotions, then be able to listen in and not just assume that people are ready to move into solution and action mode. Maybe they need to talk through things. And we've had a guest previously on the podcast, Dr. Aprilia West, that her research is on psychological flexibility and talks about riding emotional waves and processing it. And I actually just did a course with her, not a certification, a course. And it felt kind of similar to what you're talking about. It feels like you're not validating someone or you're not helping them by just talking about what are you experiencing emotionally. As a coach, it feels uncomfortable if you're not used to it, but the recipient gets exactly what they are looking for, which is having that validation. And it's not something, it should be something, I guess, more common, but it's something that we need to get trained on and use as a skill. And leaders need the reminder in coaching. So it's very relevant what you're saying.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks for sharing that perspective on like dysregulation. It's so true. When we're dysregulated, we're not open to reasoning. And dysregulation may not be, some people who have younger kids think, oh, dysregulation is like kids throwing a tantrum. But dysregulation comes in all forms. When one feels insecure about one's job, that is dysregulation. So if I'm starting to see layoffs and I'm hearing in the news that AI is going to take a lot of jobs, I'm going to start to feel insecure. That insecurity is a dysregulation. So they're in an emotional state where they may not perfectly be open to listen to reason unless that feeling of insecurity is acknowledged, validated, and regulated. I have an article coming out in the Harvard Business Review with my co-author, John Gruda. We talk about psychological insecurities, and we talk about this 3R model of working with insecurity. It starts with regulation. So like with job insecurity, it's not about reasoning people through let's use the example of AI again, like how, people's jobs might protect it. It's just validating where they are at, and that helps to regulate. So the 3Rs are regulate, relate, and reason. The second R is people need to know that their leaders care, or in a coaching encounter, that their coaches care, to demonstrate that felt concern. And then finally, that's when we get to the real problem solving, which is reasoning and trying to understand, well, what's the next step from the information that we have? The challenge in organizations often is we focus on, it's all about reasoning, but psychology knows that reasoning is like the rider on the elephant. The rider is the reasoning bit, but we have this big elephant that the rider is moving, and that's our emotions, that's our feelings. And we need to start there first to acknowledge that elephant in the room. Whether it's a coaching or leadership, we need to start with regulate, relate, and then reason.
How do you help leaders buy into that 3-armed model of being very effective? Because I could see that a lot of leaders I've coached myself, might feel like this is a waste of time and they feel urgency to get to solution mode, but this is actually the best course of action to have the best outcome.
Yeah, so I often start with them when we say listen first. I often specify even listen first to organizational pain. So to really try to understand where people's pain points are, frustrations are in the organization. And I like to use the analogy of if, say, the three of us were going on a hiking trip and we're going somewhere, and say, Emily, you're leading the trip and you're focused on that destination. Now, if one of us, maybe myself, I start to feel knee pain and I'm starting to, walk slower on that trip. Now, in the context of leadership, sometimes leaders focus so much on the destination that they don't acknowledge, I notice you're walking slower. I notice you're having some pain. Maybe let's slow down and attend to that. First, or we can walk slower as a group. So that's the same thing in organizations is we can focus so much on the destination, and pain does slow us down. But if we're able to attend to that, we can move people along to the final destination. But imagine if in that group, my pain is not acknowledged and we just press on, it's going to create a situation where, person who is in pain might pull away from the group or engage in ways that are not as helpful to the group. So acknowledging pain does feel like things are slowing down, but it's a more sustainable path to change. Often when pain is not acknowledged, it then shows up as resistance. People try to undermine the change. And at worst, then it creates cynicism that our leaders are not really attending to our pain. So I think it's critical to kind of listen to that, even though it does feel like it's a bit of a slowing down process.
Going back a little bit then, as we're exploring this field of listening as a whole, I know you've done an integrated review that goes into several different fields, including management, leadership, and communication science. For individuals who are listening to today's podcast and they themselves maybe want to go and explore some more of the research on this field, where might you point them towards in terms of things that they could be researching or things that they could be learning more about if this piques their interest?
Yeah, so there are two reviews that listeners could look up. One is the review that I wrote with my colleague Colin Fisher. It's published in the Academy of Management Annals, Listening in Organizations. And as you said, Austin, we reviewed the research, not just in management, but in communication and psychology. So that's a good place to start. There's another review by Avi Kluger, Guy Itchikoff, and colleagues in the Annual Review of Organizational Psychology. So there are two kind of review papers to start with to look at the field of listening in organization. There's an International Journal of Listening, which publishes great research on listening. That's a nice place to start. I'm also thinking your listeners, if they're coaches, they might be interested in sort of a practice perspective of from our conversation of we need to meet the person on the other side. We need to validate in organizations. We need to understand the story of change from people's perspective. What is a practical way to do that? One framework that might be useful for the listeners and that I use is, I call it the PAIN framework for listening. It's if attending to organizational pain, and that using just the acronym of PAIN to guide a conversation. P for priorities, A for anxiety, I for inertia, N for needs. It's a conversation model. Use this also in a coaching conversation to try to understand one of the pain points from a sequence, starting with P, priorities. What's often painful for people in the organization is they come with something that they want to get accomplished. They come with their priorities, but their priorities is not heard or not aligned with other people's priorities or the organization's priorities. So pain often is when my needs or my priorities are not met by the organization or misaligned. So we start with a conversation on priorities. A for anxiety, to acknowledge how people are feeling about their current work situation. I for inertia, to understand what's hindering them from the change that they hope to accomplish. Then N is for noise, where people often experience frustration and pain in the organization. And that's very true of organizations today. Information overwhelm. There's just so many things I'm hearing my leaders saying. I'm not sure what I should focus on and what's really valued in the work that I do. So that's just one way, one framework. So I'd encourage listeners to look at the research, but there are also some useful frameworks coming out of the research that can guide coaches in terms of the listening process.
If you have someone that you are working with and you're trying to work them through the pain model, for example, and they are maybe not wanting to take on the other people's perspectives, there's some pushback from that leader. What have you found to be effective in that space, or have you seen much of that occurring in the work that you do?
Could you say more of what you mean by they're not willing to take on other people's perspectives?
If it's a leader and they're getting feedback from a specific department like marketing or finance, and the leader has a certain vision where regardless of what they're hearing from other people, they're not wanting to take on that information. So maybe less so a misunderstanding about how their listening is going, but they don't desire to listen to advice from other people in the company.
My interpretation of what you're saying is that you're coaching a leader who feels that other people are not aligned with their perspectives. Like you mentioned, marketing or other functions may not be aligned with the direction that they wish to go. And so in that situation, if you're coaching a leader there where they're frustrated, like, I can't get these different departments on board. And that's common in organizations with silos, and I can't get the different teams or functions to align around this particular initiative. We start with P, with priorities. So what's often frustrating is everyone has a priority. Everyone has a job to be done or thing they want to accomplish. It's important to also see what other people's priorities are, so that the first conversation is around like validating their priorities and then helping the coachee to understand other people's priorities. And this is a coaching model that I've used that is might be helpful for some of your listeners. So I call it listen and build because in that coaching encounter, I would ask the person I'm coaching to actually have a listening conversation with the folks that they feel they're very frustrated in working with, that are not aligned with their priorities. And my challenge to that coachee is, so let's do an assignment in the next 2 weeks before we meet again. I'd like you to try to schedule a listening conversations with 3 to 4 people that you've kind of talked with in our conversation who you found it hard to work with, and to just focus to understand what are their priorities, what's important to them, what they would like to accomplish. The goal in those listening conversations is not to solve the issue that we've talked about, but just to understand that. And let's talk about that when we meet again in 2 weeks. So we start with P, priorities, and then this listen and build process is really getting the coachee to listen and then to bring them into the coaching encounter. And that's the whole thing about meeting people where they are. It's not just meeting the coachee where they are. It's about the coachee, the leader, also trying to understand that, leadership is not just about the self. Leadership is in relationship with others, and to understand that and to bring the whole system into the coaching conversation. So this model of listen and build is we start with P and the priorities. The leader goes out to listen to priorities. If it's a very compressed time, I would go even to the A, to ask the leader to listen to other people's priorities, try to understand anxieties around in the workplace, and maybe even go to I, but then bring those understandings into the coaching conversation. So in the coaching conversation where we can try to understand the situation from other people's perspectives. So that helps the leader go out of their naive reality to truly see the situation from other people's perspective. And naturally, often when we start to see from different perspectives, a solution will emerge. What's most dangerous often is the solution. Often leaders try to arrive at a solution without fully understanding other people's story of that situation.
I love having that clear model of how you can work through it and apply good listening skills. What's the impact, I guess, of the individuals that you work with as they're working on their listening? How can you notice the change and evolution?
I'd say listening is not the end, but it's the means towards the end. And the end is really growth, clear understanding of the situation. And I call it listen and build, which is building a solution that is based on a clear understanding of the reality, not just one's reality, but the reality of the different parties involved. What might be new for some of your listeners or coaches is coaching is often done in a one-to-one or one-to-group setting. But what often is missing in that coaching encounter is the other people who are related to that situation, right? So often we're in a coaching bubble, if you will. If I'm talking to a leader, it's just me and that leader, but there are all these other people that are involved in the situation whose voices are not represented in that coaching bubble. And so the way to get out of that coaching bubble is to really have the leader go and have some listening conversations and then bring that back into the next coaching meeting. So we're not just talking about the client's perspective, but we're expanding the client's perspective to understand here are all the different ways people are seeing that situation. And then we can have a more holistic conversation about the situation and then arrive at a solution that is more sustainable. Because if we're only building a solution between two perspectives, a coach and a coachee, that might be quite limiting. We're actually excluding a lot of voices from that conversation.
It ties back into what you were saying about the expansion. So you're expanding the opportunity for the different perspectives and the different voices to come in. And then that helps have a more comprehensive picture to then get to that end result. Kind of similar to what I just asked, but I guess, and you spoke to it a little bit, but I want to ask it more explicitly, is there's growth for the individuals. Is there also an impact and growth on the organizations? Or is there specific things that can be measured when listening is central to the organization's culture and systems?
Yeah. So I think one of the challenges in organizations that I'm hearing is that we need to operate from a single truth. Like we need to see the problem in the same way, have a unified voice around that. And oftentimes, so it's this fragmentation, and it's a timeless challenge in organizations, silos not working with each other. So this practice of listening is that it actually helps to build a shared truth or shared reality in the organization. That it's like the blind people and the elephant. It's the same thing that everyone's experiencing, but we tell different stories about it. I like to describe it as same yet different stories. We're all experiencing the same thing, but we're telling different stories. And the different stories then start to fragment apart to say, well, this is the real story. That story is not real. And then we start to disagree or get defensive. So as we bring these stories together through listening, we kind of arrive at really what the shared truth is. So it's a better understanding, that leads to more effective collaboration. How can this be done in a very, very practical way? Back to coaching is coaches working with a leader can ask the leader to give them assignment to go and have these listening conversations, bring that back, and the coach processes those listening conversations with the leader. The leader then goes back and, after a better understanding of the situation, goes back and closes the loop with the listening and then shares what their understanding is of the situation and where they think the group needs to go. Listening kind of breaks the bubble. So in a coaching situation, it breaks the bubble between just a limited reality between the coach and the coachee. It brings other voices in the room. In the organization, it breaks our bubble by all of us having different stories. If we truly try to validate and are able to tell the story of what's happening from other groups' perspective, then we're operating in a better shared reality, and we can come with a common solution that might be more sustainable and workable for the organization as a whole.
For example, say a leader comes to you and they are saying that they want to work on their listening. What would be some key points that people could remember when they are trying to improve this skill set?
Thanks for raising that, Austin, because I think there is existing listening training around active listening, and there are really good models for that. The model I take is very different from active listening, which is grounded in workplace challenge. So to build the listening skill and ability of a leader, I start first with what's most frustrating and challenging about your work, where people don't understand, you experience resistance, something that you're stuck with. So we start with their challenge. Then we go into a stakeholder mapping. So I'm happy to share with you, the listeners, a link to this playbook that we do on Listen and Build. We make it publicly available. So first we identify the challenge. Then we have a conversation of, well, who are the people involved in this challenge? So there's a stakeholder mapping process. The next challenge in the coaching interaction is to say, well, we're going to meet again in 2 weeks. And the next 2 weeks, I'd like you to have 2 to 3 listening conversations with these people involved in the challenge. I give them a framework for how to have these listening conversations. Number one is the goal is to understand the challenge from their side. So the goal of this conversation is not to solve, but it's to truly to understand and to validate. You may not agree with what they're saying, but that's not a conversation to voice your disagreement. You're going there with the intent to truly understand. And in 2 weeks, we're going to have a conversation about what you're hearing and try to make sense of these different realities. Now, if the leader comes back in 2 weeks and says, well, I knew it all along. This is what it was. Then maybe that's not really listening, because between two people, human beings are very complex. Two people are definitely going to have something different about the same situation. So if someone comes back in 2 weeks and says there's nothing new, I'm not surprised. They're probably living in their naive reality, listening to stories from their lens. Because truly, if someone listens in any listening conversation, if we truly listen, our worldview is going to be different in a little bit. And so that's where I challenge them. Like, we're going to start to see a shift and an expansion in how they see situations. And with that expanded view of situations, they're more likely to come up with more effective solution. So that's the listening process. I'd say to listeners, like, active listening is a great way to train listening, but there's another way, which is grounded in the workplace challenge, to actually get leaders out of the coaching room, to have some listening conversations, and to bring those conversations back as a context to talk about effective listening.
That distinction is so important and so impactful. Another question to ask you while we still have some time with you, are there any questions that you wish people would ask you about listening, or maybe ask themselves when it comes to listening?
Yeah, I like your question, Austin, about, like, how can I be a better listener? Because that's one I hear a lot. And now, how can I help people to be a better listener? And so I guess we've talked about that with active listening, challenge-based listening, or listen and build. And just to follow up on that listen and build model, if anyone's interested, we make it publicly available. So it's on our website called listeningworks.ca. So there's this process of a listen and build process that I've used. I have other instructors use. And so how do we develop listening? I would say first to think about listening as a discipline first. I guess let's think about the mindset and then the tool set to develop listening. The first mindset is that listening is like any capacity. It needs work and challenge to build, just like any capacity that we have. And so one needs to think about, what are the challenges that I need to take on to be a better listener? And the challenges are often the things that a person is most frustrated about. Like, I often tell leaders that person who's the hardest to work with is the person who's going to really help you develop. And we may not be able to fully reach a point of collaboration with the person who's hardest to work with, but can we truly understand where they're coming from? That is the listening challenge. And oftentimes when I'm asked, like, can you tell me the story of how this person is seeing that situation? Often people struggle to do that, because, like, I just cannot comprehend why they see the world in this way. So that is something, a simple practice that your listeners could do, is to think about the hardest person to work with, the most frustrating person. And then the second step is, can I tell the story of the world from how they see it? And then the third step is, can there be a middle ground between what they're saying? Can I bridge my story of the world with their story of the world? And so that's the next step, moving from listening to action.
What are you currently working on? Is there research or an angle of this that's, in development, that's behind the scenes that you can share?
Yeah. So I'm working on two things that are also related to, quite directly related, that come out from this listen and build work. Is in the listen and build process, which is both a change model, but there's also a research that informs that. So the two research projects I'm working on right now, one is looking at the role of organizational pain. Why are leaders shy away and avoid talking about painful situations in the workplace? And we see that, like, with technology, leaders are not enough acknowledging the insecurities in the workplace. Same with layoffs. Leaders tend to focus on what's next and not sufficient acknowledgement of the pain of layoff. And when pain is not acknowledged, it often turns to resistance and cynicism. So it's a work on understanding organizational pain and how to respond to organizational pain. So that's one body of work. The second body of work is on defensiveness. My colleague Dana Walker at the University of Colorado, where we're finishing up a review paper on understanding, looking similar to the listening paper. We reviewed research in psychology, management, and management, these two primary streams, trying to understand what is defensiveness, how does defensiveness occur, and what can be done to diffuse defensiveness. And so I think that maybe it's a topic for another conversation, but we have actually developed some ways for people to respond to defensiveness. How do you catch when someone is defensive? It's not just disagreement. We say it's not different from defensiveness. So how do you tell when someone is just disagreeing versus someone who's defensive? And once you know, you have the cues to notice defensiveness, the next step that we've addressed is how do you then respond to diffuse defensiveness so that the person can be more open to information?
That's so fascinating. I'm also curious of how we can tailor our own communication to not come off defensive. It seems like when we're listening and we have a hard time listening or really understanding where they're coming from, that's probably a lot of information, a signal that it's our own work to do. And that's something, that's where, okay, naive realism is coming in, and I have to do something with that.
Yeah, listening is really hard work. I'm sure we're an hour in now. You're feeling like, whoa, there's a lot of information. I'm trying hard to pay attention. And so it's this whole thing. Listening is attention. Listening is comprehension. So it's really, our brains really working a lot in listening. And it's something that we actually need to think about with organizations. Like managers often, the good managers and the best managers are often sought out to where people tend to share their problems and challenges with them. But that's a lot more work that the good managers are doing. And it's often invisible work. And then they get tired and exhausted by all these listening. So we need to think about that how do we actually create spaces for listening and also boundaries with our listening, and how do we, acknowledge the work of listening that people do? It's more than just sitting down to listen. It does take a lot of emotional, cognitive energy to truly listen.
Well, it was quite easy to listen to you today, so thank you for being here with us.
Thanks, Emily.
Is there a way that people can stay in touch with you after this episode?
Yeah, so I write a column on Psychology Today. It's called Listen and Build. So if anyone looks up Listen and Build, they can find about the painstorming model that we shared. So I have an article there that talks about painstorming to drive change, the framework for pain, which can be used in a coaching conversation, is laid out in that article there. So it's just like a simple set of questions that coaches can use to understand organizational pain or the pain that a leader might be going through in their role. So the Listen and Build blog on Psychology Today. Secondly is if they're interested in Listen and Build as a organizational change method, it's available on listeningworks.ca. This is all educational initiatives that are, the playbook is free to download. And I'm happy to follow up with folks who are using that playbook or the painstorming process. If wanted to talk that through, in my role, I'm really happy to have conversations on that. So folks can find me on LinkedIn. If they look up just Jeffrey Yip on LinkedIn, I'm at Simon Fraser University, and I'm happy to respond to any requests or LinkedIn connections there.
Well, thank you so much. We're so glad we got the chance to talk with you today. It's been such a great hour with you, and we really appreciate all the work you're doing and are glad to be able to highlight it with the Coaching Revealed podcast and just share with all of the coaches out there to learn about listening and your work.
Thanks, Austin. Thanks, Emily. I really appreciate the questions you asked and also your thoughts and the scenarios you presented so that we could ground this process in something concrete for your listeners.
Yeah, it was really fun. It was fascinating to listen to you. So thank you for everybody listening in on this topic of listening.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Coaching Revealed, brought to you by the Institute of Coaching. You can learn more about the Institute on our website at instituteofcoaching.org. You can stay up to date with new episodes of our podcast by liking and following Coaching Revealed. You can also find us on social media on LinkedIn, Instagram, and X with the handle Institute of Coaching. We also love hearing from our guests, so please reach out to us with thoughts you have on this episode and any questions you have about coaching. Until next time, this is Emily Terrani with Coaching Revealed.